on that. That would
I
be
will.
very helpful. I also would like to open up the extra sessions, the role of the popular factor or popular mobilization in the Argentine and Chilean transitions compared. I got it right?
Yes.
Okay, so Luis, it's up to you. Hi. Oh, this chair. Give you that one. He's our representative from Brazil. So how could he miss a talk on Chile and Argentina, right? Although, of course, one could throw in Brazil into this mix too, obviously. But these two places are striking because of one would expect the cultural similarity. I've been to Buenos Aires, I've not been in Chile. I've been invited there. By the way, I don't know if you know, Luis, and I'll let you talk. How many students I've had from both of these countries, from both Argentina and Chile? I would say at least 12 between them, 5 and 7, more or less. And some are pretty famous. I don't know if you've seen the writings of Claudia Heiss. She's a student of mine, and she writes a lot on Chilean affairs. And other students of mine have also published extensively. And so you are now in this distinguished generation, maybe one of the last ones, because I'm not doing this for that much longer. But I'm really happy that you picked this topic. So I'm going to shut up.
Okay. Okay, so one previous consideration, when I was preparing the presentation, I realized that I had taken on a very extensive topic. So I hope I can go through it all and it makes some sense. I'm also not very good at preparing PowerPoint presentations, so
I can do it all. I've never done it.
I'm not.
Pathetic.
I'm not good at
to
it.
learn.
Yes, I should. I should at some point. I should.
I can afford it not to, but I think you're going to have to learn.
Yes, I should. But okay, hopefully it'll make some sense. Thank you all for listening. So first of all, some like broader theoretical considerations that come from some of the readings that we've been doing. I'm going to try to focus on briefly on the transition, on the pre-transition processes of both Argentina and Chile, making some references to more structural elements that are maybe lacking in some of the readings that we have done. That's why I also tried to recommend some other readings, particularly O'Donnell. But I want to sort of lay out some of the previous historical determinations of both the dictatorships, and then that have an impact on the transition process. In the transition process, I want to focus more on the factor of popular mobilization, which I also think is sort of absent in some of the readings, which focus more
neglected at some point.
Yeah, which tend to focus more on the sort of political actors and how they establish alliances and how they move, and that as the determining factor, which I will also try to address, but I will also make a point of looking at the mobilization process. So I will first go through a couple of historical considerations, then a historical context of the emergence of the authoritarian regimes, their characteristics and the transition process, and hopefully I'm going to talk about some of the elements of the post-transition regimes, democratic consolidations, and the impact. Maybe we can get to some of the impact in the post-authoritarian regimes and social protest. So first of all, following O'Donnell and Schmidt, they established some key elements to understand the dynamics of transitions from authoritarian rule. Some of those key elements have to do with the asymmetry between these type of transitions and the transitions from democracy to authoritarian rule. That asymmetry has to do with we don't have exactly the same type. It's not that it's the same elements inverted, but it's just different. It's a different type of process. And another aspect that I think is important, particularly underlined by these authors, is the question of the indeterminacy of the process. The question of in a sense, O'Donnell says that in the transitions from democratic rule to authoritarian rule, it seems like the actors are sort of playing out a tragedy in which we all know the outcome is going to be, and it doesn't mean that outcome couldn't have been changed, but it seems much more as a tragedy that is unfolding. Instead, the process of transition from an authoritarian regime is one in which the options are much more open, and this is what they underline as sort of the indeterminacy of this process. And it's also linked to one of the key variables that they analyze, which is the permanent fear of a relapse or of a coup and a return to authoritarian rule. So from this, a couple of sort of key variables that the authors identified. One is the dynamics in the internal dynamics of the authoritarian regimes, particularly the relationship between hardliners and softliners. We've been through this a couple of sessions ago. Also, another key element is the success failure of the regimes in terms of sort of in their own terms, if they have managed to, let's say, complete their objectives, and mostly in economic terms, if they have managed to stabilize the economic and social and political situation. So this idea of success and failure is going to be very relevant in the Argentinian and both in the Argentinian and the Chilean case, and it's a contrasting element between the two cases. Another important variable for the transition is the role of the bourgeoisie. I think this is one of the aspects in which they sort of include more of a social determination or a class determination that has to do with to what extent the bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie feels threatened for the possibilities of, let's say, social revolution or substantial reforms, and therefore is more permissive towards authoritarian regimes and allows not to have political control over the situation as long as the basis of capitalist accumulations are not questioned. So that is another important variable. The other is the degree of mobilization, which they tend to view it essentially as a kind of reactive towards the decisions and the process that is generally from O'Donnell and Schmidter's vision. Essentially, it always starts from the regime in itself, and I think that is not always the case, but at least the authors make the case that the prime mover of the process of democratization is first the process of liberalization that creates a sort of opening and the possibilities to advance towards a democratic transition. Then another key variable to understand the different types of transitions is the degree of institutional involvement of the military in the authoritarian regime. That is, whether the military participated as an institution, which, for example, is the case in both cases that we are analyzing, but also whether the regime was more personalized, as in the case of Pinochet in Chile, or it was much more institutionalized as the junta of the armed forces and the different parts of the military, as was in the case of Argentina. So that is another variable.
I didn't catch that difference.
So
I'm sure you said it right. I just want to make sure we all get it, because that's not an easy point.
Yes. So in both cases, both in the Argentinian case and in the Chilean case, the military regimes are hierarchical institutional military regimes.
Hierarchical, right.
That is, the military is directly involved.
Not like Greece, let us say.
Exactly. It's not like Greece, where it is sort of a marginal or not an integral sector of the armed forces. In these cases.
So that's that distinction I know, but then you're making a second one.
Yes. The second distinction I'm making is that in the case of Chile, the regime became much more personalized around the figure of Pinochet, and instead of the Argentinian case, that was never resolved, which I'm going to talk about the consequences of that.
Thank you.
Moving forward. So then Stepan has a very large list of different types of transitions from authoritarian rule. He built sort of 8 theoretical categories. The first 3 are less relevant, at least for the cases that we have been talking about, because they have to do with external military invasion and the different forms that could take. But there are 3 that are particularly relevant for the cases of both Argentina and Chile. One is what he calls redemocratization that is from above, in a sense, it's when the regime has the initiative and controls the process of redemocratization. I'm going to try to argue that is the case of Chile, very, very much so. And then there are two other cases. One is a society-led transition, in which it is forces from below that sort of condition and control the process, and that normally coincides with some form of collapse of military rule. In the case of Argentina, it had to do with an external defeat in a military conflict. The military invaded the Malvinas Islands, tried to recover them, and was defeated, and therefore that opened a cycle of mobilization. And a third type is a pacted, and I'm going to try to argue that there are elements of pacts in both cases, but particularly in the Chilean case, there is a much stronger element of a pact. In the Argentinian case, that does not seem as prominent, and is not as prominent at all. So, given these sort of theoretical considerations, I'm going to now sort of take a step back and introduce some other things that I think are relevant to the process, that is essentially sort of the social and class composition of these societies in the pre and I will go later to in the post, but post-regime, post-authoritarian regimes. But I think that the issue to properly understand the coups, particularly the coups in Chile and Argentina, but I think this can be extended to other examples, it's important to understand what the military was responding to in terms of what were the social conditions before. So just very briefly, because this is not the center of the issue, but I think it's important. In both cases, here, of course, there are, again, similarities and differences between both cases. In both, first, the similarities, in both cases, both Argentina and Chile had undergone in the previous decades of the coups, so that's before the 70s, processes of industrializations through import substitution. So basically, to what were originally very much export-oriented economies, in the case of copper and food exports in Chile, basically food exports in the case of Argentina. Those economies had become much more complex with the introduction of a process of industrialization that was more profound in the case of Argentina, that was deeper. But this, in both cases, generated a situation in which both countries have an important industrial working class as a component of the social structure. And this is different from other countries in Latin America, which are much more peasant countries or agrarian countries. In this case, in both cases, you have essentially urban societies where the organized working class has a very important part in the political and social scenario. So this, again, from these similarities, there are then differences. In the case, particularly in the Chilean case, this has also to do with the specific way in which the Chilean regime, the Chilean democracy worked, which we have already sort of talked about several times. I'm going to go just very briefly mention that the Chilean democracy was very pluralistic in the sense that there were many parties that presented like the whole ideological range was from left to right, was represented in parties, and particularly this is a difference that an element that separates Chile from the Argentinian case and from others in Latin America. The Chilean working class was very much represented by the Communist and the Socialist Party. So in terms of the political system, it was perhaps more similar to European political systems like the French and others. Exactly, where you have a very strong left organized socialist Marxist left, which is very much rooted in the working class. That was not the case for Argentina, where the mobilization of the working class essentially took the inclusion of the working class into the political regime was done through Peronism, which was a sort of nationalist movement, or still is to a certain extent, a nationalist movement that represented a sort of a polyclass alliance between the working class and the small bourgeoisie that was essentially oriented towards the internal market. So in the case of Chile, this particular institutional arrangement and social and economic situation generated the conditions for the emergence of clearly left-wing government in the case of Allende, and that is a clear difference with the Argentinian case, which is important thinking going through the next stages, it's important to understand that the level of threat that the bourgeoisie perceived to its interest was much higher than in other cases, which will have consequences in terms of its political orientation in the process of democratization. So in contrast to this, in the Argentinian case, as O'Donnell elaborates in his understanding of the bureaucratic authoritarian state and state and social alliances in Argentina, which is the text that I recommended for today, is you have a very strong nucleus of the bourgeoisie that is organized that is directly linked to the external market, the Pampean bourgeoisie, which is essentially based on the export of meat and other food products. This has some consequences in terms of the economic dynamic of the country, in which there is the possibility of a cross class alliance between the urban working class and the small urban bourgeoisie that is internal market oriented, that is permanently in contradiction with the rural bourgeoisie. And there is a fundamental actor that is the most externalized industrial, the most transnationalized section of the industrial bourgeoisie, that is the one that O'Donnell says always plays to the winner, like always remains in power. It's a permanent actor of the alliance that is in power. So this is particularly all of this class structure is important because it generates a situation in which there is a sort of, O'Donnell says, an impossible game for Argentinian democracy, in which, since the government of Perón, which ended in 1955, there was, from 1955 to 1976, a period of permanent cycles of transitions between authoritarianism and democracy, particular and limited democracy, because Peronism was banned throughout a whole part of this period. And this makes democracy an impossible game, in the sense that none of the actors are committed to democracy, because if Peronism wins, it's perceived as an undemocratic party. So therefore it's permanently banned. That makes it a limited democracy. The military is the bourgeoisie accepts the role of the military as an arbiter between the different political factions. So that generates a permanent cycle of transitions throughout the period of 1955 to 1976. So what I want to argue with this very brief, that I hope was at least somewhat clear, introduction of more of the social structures, is that both dictatorships are very much rooted in these particular situations. In the case of Argentina, the dictatorship is very much rooted in the attempt to overcome this impasse, to overcome this political impasse, by fundamentally altering the social conditions on which the political system relies. So basically, to break the impasse through authoritarianism and to impose a complete domination of the big industrial bourgeoisie and the Pampean bourgeoisie through authoritarian means. So to break the impasse through authoritarian means. In the case of Chile, the rise of a left-wing government and all the social forces that unleashes represents a threat that the military sees as its role to annihilate that threat. So that's why in both cases you have what some authors call the reactive phase of the dictatorships are both very brutal. You have 20,000 dead in Chile, 30,000 disappeared dead in Argentina, many more imprisoned, exiled, etc. So both are very extremely repressive dictatorships. So while both are very repressive dictatorships that try to fundamentally modify the conditions on which they were grounded, I want to try to argue that in the case of the Argentinian dictatorship, it was less successful in doing so than in the Chilean dictatorship. The Chilean dictatorship managed to move from a reactive phase to a phase in which it managed to sort of build a new historical movement, a new historical moment, open up a new historical project, which has consequences for the post regimes. So, okay. So,
But would you explain why is that the case? The difference, the different end results. That is that one was more successful, the dictatorship, the other.
yes, yes, I will. So the one of the main reasons why the Argentinian dictatorship was unable to advance with more deeply as the Chilean dictatorship did was precisely because it lacked it much quickly encountered a situation of lack of unity of the ruling classes around the project of the dictatorship. So political opposition was quicker in the case of Argentina. So you have in 1976 is the coup. In 1979 you have the first. So just 3 years after, you have the first public appearances of first the human rights movement, which already started with the 1978 World Cup. I guess many
If I
people
could
know.
just add one more thing to that, is that the nature of the so-called impossible game is that once the military intervened, its purpose is gone. Whereas in the Chilean case, it was the purpose was to deal with a political social structure that was potentially still there. And I think in that sense, whether consciously or not, the Chilean military decided to construct a new regime. They called it controlled democracy or managed democracy. And it's a long process from 73 to 88, 15 years they're actually constructing it. Here, once the Peronists have been disciplined, the purpose from a bourgeoisie, and I have some qualms about using the bourgeoisie as a single category, but at least from a point of view, important economic interest, right? The point of the military regime is gone. What's the point? You killed enough of them, their leaders are dead, a lot of people are in jail, they're disciplined, so who needs them, right? In some ways. So if Galtieri invades the Malvinas, it's because, in a way, maybe you were going to say that, but in a way, within the impossible game, they become functionless. Mm-hmm. So you got to do something. And instead of a construction of a new regime, they invade Great Britain, which I think was not the wisest move. It's a kind of absurd thing that Malvinas is Great Britain, but that's the kind of absurdity we have in the world, right? I mean, they were actually right about Malvinas, but that doesn't matter.
Yes. So yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No. It's good. I mean,
it's hard actually to see why the two regimes not equally, but similarly repressive, coming in more or less in the same historical period, and then they proceed in such different ways. And a lot of different things to say about this, of course, beyond what we just said. For example, the economic policy of the Chilean junta is different.
Yeah,
but anyway.
But no, I think exactly that's the point. I mean, I think the key variable to understand why the Chilean case was more successful in that sense and managed to retain the unity of the bourgeoisie in support of the dictatorship right. Is essentially the level of threat of the previous period. I mean, the perception of the level of threat was not the same in the case of Argentina than in Chile. It was very different.
Look at the subsequent votes. Pinochet loses that referendum, but 45% of people vote to keep him. That's in 1988, right? 15 years after that. That would not have been possible in Argentina or Brazil, right? And in Chile, well, for other reason.
Yeah.
And down to this day, to some extent in the votes, you can actually see that there is support. Cast now, who was a man of the dictatorship, and had a chance of becoming the president of Chile even now. But
No, so I think that the key variable is the level of threat, which also has another aspect which I didn't mention before, but it's relevant to this, which is at least Garreton makes the case that a faction of the middle class in Chile went through a process of fascistization, so that they became like consolidated in support of the dictatorship, which is not the case in Argentina. That's so the popular base, in a sense, of the dictatorship, or the political base of the dictatorship in Chile, is much more solid than in the case of Argentina. So and that is particularly relevant because when the first signs of popular mobilization start to appear, which again combine because with the economic crisis, which hits both countries at the more or less at the same time, because both both dictatorships developed a model of opening of the economies towards foreign investment, what you could call like neoliberal model to a certain extent. In both cases, they were extremely vulnerable to external shocks. And between 1979 and 1981 is the Volcker shock here, the increase of the interest rates of the U.S. economy. There is a crisis in the international economy, and capital flows reverse. So instead of receiving capital, these countries start losing capital, and the problem of the external debt becomes very, very acute. So both dictatorships face an economic crisis in 1981. The difference is that the Chilean dictatorship has a much more solid political base in which to confront that situation of economic. So I don't think that it's essentially an economic determination. It's much more, in this case, the ability of the Chilean dictatorship to, because it came from a level of threat that was much greater, to rely on a broad middle class base and also the unity of the bourgeoisie, which was not the case in Argentina. So moving towards the transitions, the economic crisis in both cases generate. Yes.
Can I just make a small interruption?
Yes.
louder.
Just a small interruption. I think it's maybe a question for you. I don't know if you're gonna address this later on, but it's a nice claim that you made about the difference in the quality of the political foundation, right, of Chile versus Argentina. However, in Chile, the regime, the government regime, is more personalistic, despite being more well-grounded politically, while the military junta in Argentina is described by this perspective to be more institutional, but at the same time politically weaker, right? So, what do you think about that? It's culture. Yeah.
I think in a sense, the main. I think the main issue of the relative strength and weakness has to do with the broader social alliances that the military is able to build and social support that the military is able to have, and not so much with its internal composition of the functioning of the regime, because in a sense, the Chilean regime was much more personalized, but which in a sense could make it weaker because it's much more reliant on Pinochet as a main figure. But at the same time, it's standing on a much more solid base that is a much broader consensus in a fraction of the middle class and the bourgeoisie. So I think it's much more solid in its political basis, even though it's institutionally weaker. One could argue that it's probably institutionally weaker. And also, then in the Argentinian case, I haven't mentioned this, but the institutionalization is also sort of semi-feudalized in a sense, because the three branches of the armed forces, so the military, the navy, and the air force, they divide the country between so they have the junta, which is a national organ, and then they divide all of the rest from the smallest council in a city to, it's all divided between the three. So it's much more sort of driven by internal contradictions. So there are several moments in which those internal contradictions come to the fore, particularly after 1978. For example, there is an attempt by the Navy, by Macera, which was the leader of the Navy. There is an attempt to move towards a form of transition that would be much more similar, perhaps, to the Chilean case. He establishes a dialogue. This is not in the books, but in others, Macera establishes a dialogue with the Peronism in an attempt to build sort of a political way out that is pacted between Peronism and a branch of the Navy, in this case. But that does not work, and there's permanently internal frictions within the three arms. So despite that it's an institutionalized regime, and one could think that it's stronger because of that, it's very ripped with internal contradictions. Also, there wasn't unity in terms of the economic prospect. There was a nationalist faction and a more neoliberal faction, which in the case, at least Garreton argues that in the case of the Chilean regime, there is a much more clear hegemony within the military that is built around Pinochet and around the economic team, around the Chicago Boys. So
Yeah, that's the combination. It's because otherwise, I can't remember. I mean, whoever thought of Pinochet as charismatic, right? But it's a combination of the economic team, the technocratic team, and the leader, which somehow made him primus inter pares, or even more than that with respect to. I remember these admirals and Air Force General Lee, and there were people there who had personality, but they could not compete with that combination. And how Pinochet found himself to be the head of a neoliberal project like that is historically contingent, but it worked for him until it didn't.
So just to make it clear,
Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's fine.
Such a great presentation that everybody feels okay to interrupt you because you're so good. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. Just to make it clear, maybe and it's not really that, but in a way, in Chile, it was closer to what we call, for example, politics, a kind of a Bonapartism in some way, but Argentina, it could never reach that point when there is a head that can.
Well, the Bonapartist analogy works for Chile.
Yes.
Because it's more European in that sense.
In a way,
So you have a working class threat, with Allende is overthrown, right?
Exactly.
That's almost like one Bonapartist scenario.
Yeah.
I don't think anywhere else in Latin America is quite like that, right? Maybe Uruguay, I don't know.
But not to the same extent.
But this is, Okay, let's let him go
on. No problem. So no, just moving towards the transitions. So of course the transitions are very different. I was saying that there's an economic crisis that hits both countries in the beginning of the 80s. In the case of Argentina, particularly, that the economic crisis combines with a situation that was already ongoing of some sort of popular mobilization, particularly linked to human rights at the beginning. But already in 1979, there's the first attempt towards a national strike by the working class, and in the period right before the invasion of the Malvinas, which is in 1982, in the day before that was announced, there was the first actual general strike, which was the 30th of April of 1982. There's a massive general strike that paralyzes the country, that leads to open confrontation in the streets between the working class barricades and the police and the state. So that situation is very, very much acute in 1982. That leads in a way to a situation in which there is more opening in December of 1981. For the first time, the political parties of Argentina sort of reappear and form what was called the multi-party, which was which attempted to open up a dialogue with the dictatorship and to try to see if they could make a pacted transition, which will finally not work out because of the military invasion of Malvinas. So the invasion of Malvinas lasts for just 3 months.
Maybe it is Bonaparte in that way.
Yeah, in a
Right.
sense it is.
Maybe it's kind of Bonaparte too, right?
So the invasion of Malvinas lasts. The war of Malvinas lasts for 3 months.
Napoleon III did that too.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
fought in the war.
Yeah.
And he lost it too.
So no, they just that in a way also the war opens a new political moment in the country in which there is some level of opening as well, because in order the war leads to a mass sort of anti-imperialist mobilization, because it's very much felt by broad masses of the people in Argentina. The coast of the Malvinas, which is an occupied territory, an island that is in the Argentinian Sea, but it's occupied by Britain. That opens up a political space for reorganization. For example, the unions start working openly and getting food for sent to the military, to the soldiers that were fighting in Malvinas.
But you're saying it was happening before. See, I don't have such a good picture of it because, I mean, after all, I'm much more distant. And I think of the Malvinas as a big thing. But what you're saying is that there's already a beginning of mobilization and strike activity before it.
Yes.
And
culminating
so in a way, the Malvinas is a kind of way of doing something in the face of these.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying.
Yes,
right?
very much so. Very much so. I mean, it's a way. The Malvinas is a way out. I mean, the
supposed way out.
I mean, they probably thought that they won. I mean, there's a lot of different theories, but one of the most accepted one is that they thought that the U.S. was going to
allow it.
Yeah, they were going to allow it. Yeah,
I remember
exactly.
that. Galtieri was just fooled.
Yes, that the UN was the U.S. via the UN. The U.S. through the UN would apply sort of the Monroe Doctrine.
Mrs. Thatcher is in power in Britain, right? She is really a pretty tough, aggressive politician. Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States, a kind of elective affinity between Britain and the United Kingdom is obvious. And this guy Galtieri and some of the others imagine that they'll be supported in this, because after all, the United States is an anti-colonial country.
Exactly. That was the calculus. They made a mistake in that, right? But so the process of sort of opening from below that had already started with social struggles, becomes much stronger. I mean, for example, the student movement is allowed to reorganize itself. It's essentially as people that were organized, getting food and stuff to send to the soldiers, and so of course this level of mobilization once the Argentinian army is defeated in Malvinas, which was probably a pretty obvious outcome, leads to a mass sort of mass insurrection in the streets. There's on 15th of June is the surrender, and there's a huge protest in the streets of Buenos Aires and around the country. And on the same day, the Galtieri, which was the acting president of the junta, is replaced, but for the first time, he's not replaced through the mechanisms of the junta itself. So that already reveals the existence of a very deep internal crisis within the three different sections of the armed forces, which I was referring to before. So he was replaced through different mechanisms, and the new military government takes power, which is Vignone, which is sort of one could argue that that's the beginning of the actual transition, because the institutional mechanisms, the dictatorship, are no longer working, and you have a complete change in terms of the regime in its control of the street, its control of the political situation is completely out of the picture. So you have basically, despite the fact, one of the readings, I think it was in the Stepan one, they argue that you cannot say that there was a collapse of the regime because it's 18 months, and the elections take place under military.
I find that argument stupid.
Yeah, but it's like I think it's collapse. I mean, it's
I mean,
collapse.
just because you totter, a building is collapsing and it's going like that,
Exactly.
doesn't mean it's not collapsing.
And an interesting thing is that it collapses way before the multipartidaria, which was the Peronists and the radical part of the two biggest parties of Argentina, and other smaller parties participated. It collapses much more quicker than the traditional political forces can sort of step in to fill in the void. So there is an 18-month period in which you have broad democratic liberties, mass organization, which in a way is very different from what we're going to see in the now.
The contrast is Greece. That's why they say, 18 months against, a few weeks. But and they do make the point that because in Greece it's not the hierarchical military, but just a kind of collection of officers who form the junta. Once they get screwed up, in that case, defeat by Turkey in Cyprus, that's it. Whereas here, the hierarchical military, just because the team of the junta is out, the hierarchical military is capable of controlling the situation to some extent. But it's not a huge difference. Not a huge difference.
And also the extent to which it is able to control the situation is really less than I think that is there. Because essentially what comes after is, I mean they are taken to trial. I'm going to talk about this in a bit.
Who remembers Vignone, even the name? No one even knows
absolutely
who these people are.
Yeah.
Right? Did you know who he was before you started reading?
Yes, I knew.
But you're Argentine. No one else even knows. And who was the head of the junta? I forget the name. Temporarily the head of the junta replacing Galtieri.
No, Vignone is.
Vignone.
But the junta is effectively dissolved.
It's dissolved.
So you don't have.
Right,
I mean, it's not through the institutional agreements that Vignone arrives.
Right.
It's just
It's nothing.
It's nothing. Yeah, it's essentially a transition towards to oversee the situation until the elections. So this situation of collapse is very much in contrast to the situation in Chile, where the same economic crisis that started in the early 80s generates a process of recomposition of the popular forces, and there's a remobilization, which has fundamentally some new actors, particularly because of the neoliberal programs that generated mass unemployment, etc. One of the main actors is going to be the shantytown dwellers, the pobladores, are called in Chile, the people that live in illegal land occupations. And so basically they're going to be one of the focus of resistance. But in between 1983 and 1986, there is a mass upsurge in resistance against the dictatorship. So this mass upsurge is probably much bigger than the Argentinian case. So sort of the question there appears, why in the Argentinian case, the mobilization led to the fall of the dictatorship and the collapse of the dictatorship and much more abrupt end of the dictatorship than in the Chilean case. So there's where there's a lot of debate in relation to what happened between 1983 and 1986. So, for example, in the case of Garretón, he emphasizes the existence of two different strategies within the popular movement between 1983 and 1986. One of those strategies is more prone to negotiation, which is led by the parties which we already know existed, but sort of transformed. The one that remains the same is the Christian Democrats. They were important. We have seen in the previous period. They are still important now. And so there is a section that is basically composed by the Christian Democrats, the right wing of the Socialist Party. It was called Núñez faction. So that section of the opposition is more interested in trying to seek for a negotiated way out than there. And then there is a more radical fraction of the opposition against the regime that is the MDP, which is basically based on the Communist Party and the left of the Socialist Party and other radical left formations that are much more oriented towards us forcing the end of the dictatorship through mass mobilization and insurrectional tactics. So there is a tactical difference in the opposition. One is more centered towards negotiation with the regime, and the the other is much more prone to generate an insurrectional way out of the dictatorship. What I also gave you a text by James Petras and others that he argues that the role played essentially by AD, which is this formation of the more pro-negotiation section of the opposition, basically ends up opening up a negotiation with the regime, which allows for the Pinochet regime to crush the more radical sections of the opposition, and all of this must be understood again, going back to the very important problem of the level of threat that was perceived by the bourgeoisie and by also sections of the middle class,
It's the period when the Argentina has fallen, right?
Yes.
83, they are gone, and this is going on in Chile between 83 and let's say 88 is the referendum. So
yes.
This is a 3-4 year period,
Yeah.
what you're describing. I just want to say it so that people have a sense that these are actually simultaneous. They're very, very different, yet to some extent simultaneous.
Yeah.
In one case, it's collapsed. The parties come back, elections. Alfonso becomes president in 83 already, right? So you have a democratic elected president in Argentina, whereas in Chile, this is still going on in that form.
Exactly. So there's a period of mass upsurge between 83 and 86, which ends in 86 basically because at least in Petras' argument, because a fraction of the opposition to the regime and a fraction of the opposition isolate the more radical section of the opposition and open a path of negotiated transition, which is in a way a negotiated transition, but in which the regime controls much more the terms of the negotiation than in others. Right. So it's precisely because by 1986 the economic situation is improving. So you have an economic boom between 1986 and 1989. So the regime is in stronger conditions to impose the conditions. It's in a stronger state to impose the conditions of the negotiated transition, and that leads to the particularities of the Chilean transition, in which first of all in 1980 there was already an attempt to institutionalize the dictatorship through a constitutional reform, the birth of a new constitution, which is the 1980 constitution, which already established a mechanism for institutionalization of the regime, which was a long-term mechanism that had an important point in 1989, where there was going to be a plebiscite to see if the dictatorship continued or not. So the defeat of the popular upsurge allows for a return to that agenda, to the agenda of institutionalization led by the authoritarian regime.
This was an amazing difference, right? In 80, after all, the Argentine junta is in power too. They were not thinking of a constitutional restructuring and a scenario, right? I mean, that's kind of fascinating how that was. I have actually I have a student who wrote this probably the best book on the 1980 Constitution, Robert Barros. He was my student a really long time ago, but I didn't quite understand ever, and even in this book, of what made them go on that path. I mean, 80 they already have a kind of scenario of eventually perhaps leaving power, not necessarily in 89. Because I think the 88 referendum decided that. Yeah. But still a scenario of some kind of managed democracy. In Argentina, nothing like that, right?
No, and I think that has to do with a much stronger base. I mean, they were thinking of how to institutionalize the regime. And in those sort of, if you take the time frame that the dictatorship had thought, Pinochet would have been in power until 1997.
Exactly. So, if he won the referendum.
If he had won the referendum. So
I hope you all know, that little detail is such an amazing thing. There's even a movie about it, right? A movie called No. You should see it because it's about that referendum, which Pinochet and the other military chiefs thought they were going to win. But they lost it, right? And so then 89, the regime comes to an end. But it could have stayed for, as they imagined, until the 90s.
Yeah. But also the fact that it's that the regime manages to control the transition and negotiate the transition with a fraction of the opposition makes even though they lose the the 1988 referendum, so they have to leave power in 1989. Even though they eventually leave power, it's a debate sort of when does the transition finish, and there's a lot of debate there because, for example, Garreton argues that precisely because they were able to control the transition, there are many authoritarian enclaves in
Garreton's term for it.
Exactly, in the regime.
Undemocratic enclaves. I hope you catch that. That's a really fascinating point, which I don't know. You probably Brazil. You can say once the military is out of power, are there any enclaves? Yes, of course, there's the enclave of the military itself, which is always but in Chile, there's the Constitution, which is Pinochet's. There are the constitutional judges.
Yes.
There's a Senate. I'm not sure now if I'm giving an exhaustive list. And these stay.
Yes.
And what you're explaining is how that was possible, that these footholds remain. Somebody could say that even down to today,
yes,
the Constitution, that would not be correct in my view, but it is formally correct.
Yeah. And not only, I mean, not only the enclaves that you have mentioned, but also the institutional role of the military is guaranteed through
Pinochet's commander-in-chief.
Yeah, Pinochet is commander-in-chief, and they have also guaranteed the relative autonomy of the military vis-a-vis the government because they passed a law. So between 1986 and 1988, the regime passes a whole bunch of laws that will survive until some of them survive.
And in Argentina, you don't have anything.
No. The military tried to give self-amnesty, but that was overruled. So
how did they try to do that, by the way?
Legally, like a law.
During the Bignone,
during Bignone.
Still,
but
they passed some kind of decree.
Exactly, a decree of self-amnesty.
But then there was Menem after that.
Yes, that
was also
amnestied them.
Right?
Yes, which was eventually overruled again. I'm going to see if I can.
In Chile, they tried to arrest Pinochet, and it did. But Contreras, one guy who was in charge of some of the worst violations, eventually wound up to be arrested and tried and arrested and jailed. But in Argentina, there are a lot of
yes, a lot of most of them,
and the majority of the bureaucrats or generals, even middle ranking, stay.
Yes,
right?
yes.
In Chile.
In Chile, yes. And not only that, they guarantee financing independent from the budget. So the law guarantees them a 10% of the budget and also a fixed amount from the budget, and also the 10% of the exports of the copper exports. So their financing does not have. I mean, they have independent financing from the state.
Maybe the most important point.
Exactly. So that allows them a huge autonomy vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis the government.
Right.
So these authoritarian enclaves sort of survive through a large period. So there's a debate: when does the transition end? And some of the authoritarian enclaves eventually are turned back, but the whole period after that, and one could argue in a sense up until now, that the institutional legacy of the dictatorship is much more stronger than in the Argentinian case. For example, and if we relate that to cycles of popular mobilization afterwards, one of the first mobilizations, massive mobilizations, that was in 2006. The high school students, they took over the schools, and there was a massive period of mobilization, fundamentally of high school students, was against the LOCE, which was the organic law of education, which came also from the Pinochet. It was one of the laws that were passed between 1986 and 1988. So the whole institutional arrangement of the Chilean democratic regime is much more conditioned by the role of the military and by the perseverance of the military. And of course, that there is a permanent that also makes one of the elements of uncertainty of the democratic transition much more clearer, which is because the military has its own has all of these enclaves and has its own financing and has the possibility of there being a new coup is there permanently. I mean, there are several attempts in the early 90s when there were some attempts to advance with forms of transitional justice, which never which never materialized or just materialized very partially. The case of Argentina, in that sense, is very different. Between in 83, one could argue that in 83 the democratic transition is completely over with the government of Alfonsín, which won the elections, which is also the first time that a non-Peronist, the first time since Peronism exists, that a non-Peronist president wins an election.
Game is not supposed to be allowing.
The impossible game is over, in a sense. So
interesting, yeah.
One of the and also that leads to the formation of I mean, maybe you've seen the movie Argentina 1985. There's a whole the formation of a commission, the CONADEP, which produces a report that is the Nunca Más, Never Again, which is a very detailed report of the human rights violations, and many of them are imprisoned. They are in 1987. There is a military uprising that tries to condition that tries to condition the process of transitional justice, but I mean, the Alfonsín government negotiates with the military and passes a law which is obediencia de vida, due obedience, which basically meant that you cannot judge the lower ranks of the military, because once the junta was judged, they started to judge the lower ranks of the military, and that law that stopped that. But at the same time, that attempt, that it's important to say that attempt met massive popular response. I mean, there were millions of people in the streets. It was in Semana Santa.
The military.
Yes, against
the Carapintadas.
Yes, against the first uprising of the Carapintadas. Yes.
Painted faces.
Yeah, they're going to. They will attempt one more in 91, but they are already completely politically isolated.
So people went out on the street.
Yes, they surrounded the biggest Campo de Mayo, which is the biggest military base in Argentina. Had about 500,000 people surrounding it. There are pictures of the people just stopping the tanks in the street. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the main square of the city of Buenos Aires. Right. So there was no way that the military coup was going to be able to overcome that situation.
The hierarchical military helps to suppress the eventual.
Yes, after that, the Carapintadas are and also the institutional role of the military goes through different democratic governments, has been just completely the military has practically no institutional role in Argentina. So there's no mandatory military service that was eliminated in 95. The military is basically completely unfinanced and plays absolutely no role in internal politics, to the point that in 2001, when there was a popular uprising against the neoliberal policies that had started with Menem, etc., which is where the reading that we had ended, the military cannot play any role in popular repression. It just plays absolutely no role. And instead, in the Chilean case, the whole post dictatorship regime is very much conditioned by the permanence of the military. And just to conclude, I mean, I think that there's a hypothesis in O'Donnell, which basically he says that that he differentiates between two types of non-revolutionary transitions. One is pacted and controlled by the regime, and the other is collapse. So we have like two very clear cases of that. And he argues, his hypothesis is that the collapse would lead to a deeper democratization, which I think is corroborated in these two cases. The democratization of Argentina is deeper. He also argues that it allows for a chance of a broader economic and social agenda, which is probably also the case. I mean, the neoliberal reforms were much deeper, also continued through are much deeper in Chile for a longer period. But he also says that transitions through collapse are more vulnerable to relapse, to the possibility of a coup and again. And I don't think that is, in this case at least, that does not apply. The question is why. I think part of it may be because of the way in which the military was eliminated as a political actor in the process of transition in itself, but also going back to some of the initial things that I said, one could also make the case that the role of the military was ending the impossible game, and it ended the impossible game. So it generated the neoliberal program that the military enforced, generated the social conditions for there to be a stable democracy, because precisely it eliminated any possible threat from below in that sense. So it eliminated the possibilities of this sort of polyclass alliance between the working class and the small bourgeoisie, and that level of threat did not remain in the post period. So again, you have, if that is the case, I mean, the question of success and failure is kind of relativized in a sense, because yes, you have a very long period of democracy, but also it's a democracy that, compared to the promises of 1983, has not been able to deliver on the promises of social justice, of economic justice, etc., throughout the whole period. So basically, that's all.
Well, that's quite wonderful, Luis. Really appreciate that. And just a few comments about causes and then outcomes. That is in your excellent presentation, because you're really historical and comparative, so we're not suppressing anything. But I think that even in your presentation, one can see three possible causes for the difference. One is, but even four possible causes: the political situation to which the bureaucratic authoritarian regime responds to is different in two cases. I mean, what could be more different than a political framework which is dominated by Peronism on the one side, and something like a competitive pluralistic party system on the other? I mean, so the starting points are really different. Does that structure everything? Well, it affects everything for sure. So that's the first. The second, that probably is connected to that, is you stress it, and you really stress this heavily, the desire of the Chilean regime to institutionalize itself in terms of a political and economic frame, which, of course, if institutionalization is to be relevant, it's supposed to make the regime much more stable. So that's the second factor. The third factor is somewhat the title of your presentation, but I think that it is not the primary explanatory variable. It plays a role of the intermediate variable. It's the role of popular movements, because popular movements themselves are structured by the initial situation, the institutionalization, and lack of and relative success in those two cases. And so, in that sense, if it plays a role, it plays a role in terms of the mediating the fundamental. And then, of course, a historian would certainly ask you, in terms of the immediate cause, the efficient cause, namely Malvinas, Falklands, right? I mean, the Chilean generals had no opportunity and probably no great interest. There were wars fought between Chile, for example, and Peru previously, but there's no military adventure. The Chilean generals don't get involved in a military adventure when they are, in some kind of when they are facing some kind of challenge, and that could be, part of the causal structure. So that's the causality, which is always very difficult, because one can only do ultimately what you did, namely to focus on all these factors. I don't think you stress the Malvinas that much. For you, that's really that's the way that the regime tries to get out of troubles which come from elsewhere. But it is in that context you stress the popular movements, and what I just suggested is that their challenge is to some extent dependent on the other two variables. So then outcomes. I think it's kind of interesting, and it has nothing to do with Argentine patriotism on your part, but you seem to evaluate the Argentine transition to be more successful, right? And the Chilean one, because of all these enclaves, and you're following the Chilean author, Antonio Garzón, and plenty of other people too talk about this. Argentina doesn't have them. So if you have enclaves, well, that the transition is not complete. You remember even the title of Liz and Stefan is incomplete. I think that's what we have, an incomplete transition for Chile, right? They say incomplete transition near consolidation. That's a very strange title, right? Because incomplete transition, yes, I mean, they're the enclaves, and the Constitution itself perhaps could be treated as an enclave. In my mind, under President Lagos in 2005, they kind of get rid of most of the other enclaves. So the Constitution survives, and it has some features which make the electoral rule, for example, which make a genuine democracy more difficult. But still, it's not to say that it's incomplete. This is 1996 when they write it, when before Lagos was reformed. To say after 2005 that it is incomplete is tough. But you seem to take some extent that position. And here is the other side. The other side is that all these contexts in the Chilean case give rise to popular mobilization. So on the one side, it's true that the transition is less complete. On the other side, the society remains a little bit more active than in the Argentine case. And then, let me complete the picture. You could say in Chile, the cycle, yes, it's possible that given the strength of the military, its advantages, that the cycle would return. Well, what about the Argentine case? Okay, so you could say in the Argentine case, the transition is complete. What about consolidation? And I think there's a concept which you are actually familiar with, but I think the class should be conscious of it. O'Donnell's idea of delegative democracy. And in the text here, Linz and Stefan also introduced that the Argentine transition is successful. The cycle does not return. The military is in no position to carry out coups, but instead you have the delegative democracy introduced by Menem. And I don't know, you or the expert, would one describe the subsequent history of Argentina after the Menem presidency as in some sense still continuing in this delegative democratic tradition. Now in Chile, you don't have that. So on the one side, the transition is more complete in the Argentine case. On the other side, the quality of democracy, and that's the way that Linz and Stefan were treated. The Argentine case is perhaps more problematic. That is, in Chile, in spite of the enclaves, a democratic society is capable of influencing politics on a lot of different stages, and perhaps the way the impossible game ends in the Argentine case, namely in delegative democracy, which means the old problem of pluralism is no longer relevant, right? The old impossible game is gone, but at the same time, the quality of democracy is not especially high. I don't know, what your view on that particular subject is, but I think one could make the argument that whereas you stress the relative success of the Argentine case, one could say that, well, there are pluses on both sides and negatives on both sides. And the Chilean transition may not be complete down to this day, and that's what the constitutional struggle may be about. On the other side, the society, civil society is in better position to affect politics in the Chilean case than in the Argentine case. I don't know if that's actually true though, because I don't know the history after the Menem period. So those would be my comments on your really excellent presentation. Maybe we could open up the floor.
Yeah,
because I've been talking too much, and he gave a long presentation, and perhaps people have issues they want to raise in relationship to these two cases. Of course, the two cases don't exhaust comparative study of the region, because like Brazil would be also if you wanted to throw Brazil into the mix, for example, that would be an interesting thing to throw to. It's only addressed to Lucas, but maybe some of you know the case. Is the transition complete in the Brazilian case compared to, let us say, the Chilean case with its democratic enclave? And then compared to the Argentine case, is the quality of democracy in the Brazilian case is finally something that neither relevant to Argentina or to Chile? Was there a chance that the cycle will return in the Brazilian case, which has not happened in Argentina, and I don't think it has happened in Chile either, but obviously in Brazil, given the recent period that you have gone through, we can ask that question.
Very militarized.
Right? Now in Argentina, you got to be careful with what you say, right? In Argentina, you could have your own Bolsonaro very quickly.
Coming up, coming up next Sunday.
Really?
Why not? We really hope it's not going to happen. By the way, you notice that in the case of Poland, we don't want to shift to Central Europe, but in the case of Poland, the populist authoritarians have apparently lost their election.
Really?
Is Milei going to win in Argentina?
It appears so.
Okay.
Just a question. I think you mentioned it, not maybe my question. So in the Argentinian case, you say they were perfect black, right? My question is, apart from what you talked about, the structure of leadership, whatever, is it also related, connected to the complete lack of legitimacy compared to the Chilean case? That is, it seems that in the Chilean case, there is still some kind of a social base that to some extent, but not in the or
Of the military?
yes, on the government. When it collapsed.
I mean, particularly of the military, there is in the Argentinian case, it's very much discredited because of the defeat in the Falklands War and the way. I mean, it was very much discredited by all. I mean, it's no longer a reliable ally for the bourgeoisie, which was one of the. I mean, the bourgeoisie had accepted it as an arbiter of the social and political situation. It's no longer a reliable ally because, I mean, it's an ally that takes you to war with Great Britain. I mean, Great Britain and the Argentinian bourgeoisie have a very long connection, so it's not a very reliable ally. It's very much discredited in that sense. It's popularly discredited, and if you compare, I mean, that has consequences in terms, for example, if you compare military budgets in the region, Argentina has the comparatively lowest one. So
Amazing, right?
the military really plays no. I mean, it cannot even be deployed for example, internal, let's say, internal commotions such as, I don't know, earth flooding or something. They use the gendarmerie, which is an ad hoc force that was created precisely because they cannot use the military.
Even though it's not an immediate cause, the Peruvian Chilean War in the Pacific actually led the military to that very high status. I was wondering though, maybe it's not confirmed in my head yet, but do you see any role of a national identity that could be related to this? Because we're sort of thinking that maybe since the Argentine military lost the war against reason, there could be a different identity formation on what the population needs or wants, how they see themselves against children. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I had never thought about that. Maybe you can say more.
Right now. Makes them probably going to parallel because
I mean, the national identity in Argentina, I mean, the military really, it's, I mean, if you like, it's very different when in Chile, the military is very much still to this day, like part of national parades, and you see them like parading in the city. And in Argentina, a military parade is extremely rare. And it makes any government that has a military parade, it looks really bad. So it's like there's this. I mean, it's really not part. I mean, just until now, which we were discussing with Milei, which his vice president, like vice presidential candidate, she is the daughter of and the granddaughter and the daughter of generals, and for the first time in a long time, there's sort of a national reconciliation, at least discourse around the problem of the military.
Yeah,
But the whole national identity of Argentina is
you're gonna
very
have to
much
explain
separated.
that to us of how that is possible, because I just know from the newspapers, right? I mean, I wasn't aware that this kind of possibility was even brewing, and your interpretation, it should not even be possible.
Yes.
And yet,
I mean, it's incredible. What a year ago, when Argentina 1985, this movie came out, which shows the trials against the military, it was received by standing ovations in the cinemas, like the packed movie theaters, standing ovations, which was to a certain extent like showing that there's still a very strong democratic conscience around the problem of the coup. And I know the coup was on the 24th of March. Every year on the 24th of March, there's mass demonstrations against the coup to this day.
right,
So it's very. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the post 2001 situation. Like, so 2001, there was a massive uprising in Argentina that sort of ended the worst part of the neoliberal period, but also led to a reaccommodation of political forces, from which Kirchnerism emerged as a sort of 21st century version of the Peronist alliance of before. And it's complicated, but to a large extent, I mean, I think that the failures of the of of the successive Kirchner's governments has created an opening for a right wing.
what's the
Massive.
status of the military in Brazil? I mean, would you say that compared to Argentina, it's much higher?
Oh, yes.
And of course, the military negotiated itself out of the military regime by gradually introducing elements of competition. So its behavior is completely different.
Yeah, the position was very much more actuated than that, and so we kind of remained a relevant political actor. And well, we just had with Bolsonaro.
Well, that's the question of Bolsonaro, right?
This was the most militarized government in terms of the personnel composition of the state.
After the transition.
No, in the
Ever.
whole of
Ever.
President.
Yeah, because they use civilians in the older military for most governmental positions. So this is the most. But so Bolsonaro, this is the that would be another talk for some of you.
Which
Is
very interesting.
the Brazil Argentina comparison, right? I don't want to be scared.
No, but it's a very
about that outcome. But that would be, on that level, Chile is quite different in terms of its.
Unless Cast wins. No?
Yes.
I mean, Cast could have a more similar, I think, to.
Yeah, go ahead, Javier. Just speak up, please, so that poor Andrew can hear you.
So like we were saying about the combination of Pinochet and the Chicago Boys, whereas Videla was notorious for being like completely or like very, very bad economic management, right? Do you think that maybe the Argentinian regime could have a stronger base if they managed the economy similar to what they did in Chile? And what do you think was like the role of the?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And if we had enough time and you had enough energy, probably one ought to put on the board, some economic comparisons between the two. Is that you said it, obviously, so it's not that you didn't say it, but somehow to an external observer like me, this neoliberal thing eventually led to crisis everywhere. But in Chile, it was relatively successful. I mean, that's the impression one gets. And then you discussed a period in the 80s when it too went through a crisis. But after 86, you said they recovered. So it's a relatively brief interruption. Whereas in Argentina, you can't really speak about a successful period. I mean, of the period of military rule. Not that, of course, in the administration of Alfonsín, you had a terrible economic crisis as well, and it's unfortunately Menem who managed to somehow stabilize it. A populist turning neoliberal plays the role in some weird way that the military regime played in the Chilean case. But I think what Javier is doing is saying that if you really wanted to push it, could you explain the difference in outcome on the basis of not only different economic policies but different relative success?
And I'm asking because like of the previous class when we were speaking about the arenas and the economic arenas and so yeah, I'm wondering like if you think that also that backup that the Chilean dictatorship received was also like because of material conditions, whereas in Argentina the material conditions were very, very poor in comparison. I just was wondering about that.
Luis.
So, I mean, I think I can recommend. There's a very good short article that by Tomás Undurraga, sort of economic sociologist, that compares the two. I can send it to
you. Could send it to all of us.
He compares the two neoliberalization processes, and he elaborates a series of like differences and variables and stuff that is good for the comparative case. I will say one thing that I think is important, that is more structural in a sense, that is although both economies are essentially shifted from a model of industrialization from import substitution towards external market dependent model, there is one thing that is very specific, and I think O'Donnell is very right in underlining that of the Argentinian case, that is what you are exporting, and the fact that what you are exporting is our wage goods. I mean, they are essentially agricultural products that are part of the generates a tension that is not present in the Chilean case. I mean, Chile the main export is copper, and when now essentially wood, like yeah. So I mean, both are very vulnerable to shifting external international prices of the commodities. But the commodity that Chile exports is not. So if the external prices go up, the commodity there's more. Chile has, of course, they also kept Codelco, which is different. That in the Argentinian case, external trade is not nationalized, and the landowners were never expropriated or anything. But also in the Argentinian case, if the international prices for the commodities that Argentina is selling go up, that means that the internal price of food goes up. And that is a permanent problem in Argentina. So every cycle of economic crisis ends up in an inflationary cycle. So, for example, right now we have 138 accumulated inflation in the last year. So that is
of course, part of the secret why
Milei, exactly. So there is the fact that the central export of Argentina are parts that make up the wage basket, the goods that people buy. Exactly. That means that if external prices go up, the internal prices go up unless there is some state mechanism to avoid that. And there is always struggle around those state mechanisms. So, for example, if you put taxes on those, that you get, the landowners don't like that, and they react violently against that. So that is like a permanent thing that the military could not solve because it's a structural problem. I mean, whereas in the Chilean case, I think there is much more possibility.
Yeah, we should read that piece because this is really, obviously a very important part of the equation. I never understood. I was actually I guess it was in the early 2000s in Buenos Aires. You literally couldn't go to a bank
Oh no, of
to,
course.
to pick up money.
Savings were
I mean,
free.
the level of inflation, it was really, really scary, even for tourists. And imagine for, people living there who, after all, their food prices and all the rest become. So this was, and I don't think that, well, probably, other Latin American countries had somewhat similar periods, but this is the most extreme. And I think that that's part of this, the structure. Military put itself in charge at a time of a crisis that it could not manage. Right, that's what you're saying.
And then you had the only other country that had levels of hyperinflation similar to Argentina is Weimar Germany.
Yes, yes.
So it's
Yes, that's right. Anybody else? That's really questions. Yes, please, Ben.
I have two questions. The first may be unfair, the second is maybe more fair. So we've been operating in this class with this vaguely political economic framework that allows us to compare different variables. And then you've thrown in this very odd set of variables that relate to questions of fear and memory. And how do you relate those two? How do we judge or calculate issues of fear alongside political and economic concerns? It feels like sometimes when you're speaking about it, it's an infinitely large fear that totally paralyzes you. Sometimes it's a completely manageable fear. Are there degrees of fear? Are there things to look at? Is it speeches? Is it rhetoric? How do you think about fear? That's the unfair question. The more fair question is about Andrew's response to you. Andrew said that in your speech, in your lecture, you essentially position popular mobilization as an intermediary variable. And you began the talk by saying that we don't think about popular mobilization enough. Do you think that repeats that problem? Do you think it just tucks popular mobilization away and be caused by something else and causes us to not take it seriously? Or do you think that's a fine way to approach it? Do you have problems with Andrew's response?
So the first one, I don't know if it's hard to quantify fear or level of threat, but I mean, it's something that the authors use to basically, which I think is, to basically sort of theorize a very descriptive thing that is basically, on the one hand, you had direct threats against private property, against the continuity of private property as a social regime. In the case of Chile, you had workers taking over factories and people being expropriated, bourgeois landowners their lands being occupied, the industrial enterprises occupied by the workers, etc., and that being recognized by the state during Allende. And you don't have that level of threat. I mean, it's not a subjective problem of how the threat is perceived, although that exists, of course. But there is sort of an objective situation in which the extent to which the regime of capitalist accumulation was questioned in Chile has no parallel to the situation in Argentina. So, I mean, the level of threat is then, of course, subjectively perceived. And one could say, I mean, I don't know, one could argue that people have perceived levels of threat that are not actually real, as sometimes happens. I don't know if you've seen, for example, the movie The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, of the coup against Chavez, and you have a very rich person saying they're coming with grenades, and that was absolutely not real. So the level of threat, of course, is perceived subjectively, but there is an objective element that is there.
So you're saying that there's these two absolute extremes, and even if it's maybe 10 points lower, 10 points higher, we can still vaguely say there's clear obvious fears here, clear lack of fears here. We can use that as a sort of binary 1-0 variable.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah. Which the other question is the level of fear of the possibility of the return of the military, which I think is much more subjective. It's much harder to actually evaluate, but then again, it has to do with how social and political actors perceive certain should read certain political situations, which you could, I don't know, deduce from their public statements. I think that one is probably easier. And the other one, no, I have no quarrels with thinking of popular mobilization as an intermediary variable. I do think that it is more relevant than what
Very sort of sad,
than what the authors give to it. In a sense, I mean, I am not convinced by the statement that the processes of redemocratization start always from above, that the initiative is always from above. I think that the from above is I think it's the other way around, actually. At first, there is some sort of crisis, social crisis, involving some level of popular mobilization, which leads to a reaction. But yeah, I think it's intermediate.
I mean, you argued that vote for Argentina and Chile because even before the Malvinas crisis, you say there is, and I should remember it because I was alive and all the rest. There are enough strike movements, challenges, and disruptions, and in a way, there is a kind of causal, but intermediate or ultimate doesn't matter so much. It plays a role, and in the Chilean case, at a later stage, the compromise that leads then to the modality of transition is affected by the challenges of the 80s. So it plays a role, and I think that you have demonstrated. Now let's before I go to I'll make the last point. So please.
I actually want to go back to something that you said in your comments about the quality of democracy in Argentina. First of all, do you agree with that? After the transition, period of consolidation, we should probably qualify the quality of democracy.
I was going to say that too. Yeah.
And if you do, where do you see arguments that have to do with the way that the transition happened versus the economy and infrastructural issues that you talked about and contributing to?
Yeah, that's the point is that even if we don't take that the popular movements to be the ultimate cause for the two transitions and the differences, what you're asking, and I also was going to say that, is that for the quality of democracy, it makes a difference. Makes a difference, and in that sense, one might come up with a somewhat different evaluation of the two cases because in Chile, it's going on a kind of contestation between civil society, political society, and the state continues down to this time. So in that sense, the transition is not complete. The role of popular movements has created a more active society as against this delegative democracy, but it's correct. And I got to be careful. It can be applied to the Menem period, but whether it can be applied to the Kirchner period in the same way is another question. But delegative democracy means a low quality democracy, right? Whereas a contestatory model in which you are fighting against authoritarian enclaves means also a more active society. Does that mean bad things can lead to some good things? No, but they are balanced by some good things. I don't know how inactive Argentine society is, of course, and at that level, even delegative democracy, after all, can be challenged. So that's the. I think what you're also asking is do these two paths make a difference not only in terms of their causes but also in terms of their outcomes for the quality of democracy?
I mean, I think there's first a whole question of how one measures the quality of democracy, right? But I was mainly focusing on the role of the military in terms of the of how if the military has a prominent role in as a non-democratic institution, as the non-democratic institution of the modern state, it has a prominent role in politics or not, and I think that in the Chilean case, it has a much more prominent role than the Argentinian case.
Touché. That is, if you make the argument in terms of is a democracy but the military remains that strong.
Yeah, exactly.
But as democratic as one in which it has marginalized, then I think the case for Argentina becomes pretty strong.
Yeah. No, but I do think, I mean, of course, with the quality of democracy also in terms of social activation is very important, at least normatively. For me, is very important. But I think that also in that case, it's going to seem that I am chauvinistic, but I also think that in that case, the Argentinian result is much more. There's a higher level of social activation. So, for example, the uprising of 2019 in Chile, one of the main slogans was Chile despertó, Chile awakened, which basically means that there was a collective reckoning that there was 30 years in which Chile was asleep. So at least collectively, the movement is recognizing that there was a low level of political
In
activation.
2019.
Yeah, in 2019. So you have in Chile, I mean, the cycle starts in 2000. Of popular uprising starts in 2006 with the high school students, 2011 with the university students, 2018. Yeah, you have between 2013 there's a wave of strikes. Then 2018 there's the movement against the AFP, which is the private pension system, and also a huge feminist revolt, which is very famous.
It's a combination of old and new things. Right?
Exactly.
Because some of it has to do with the neoliberal policies which still survive, and some of it has to do with new issues. Feminism is not an issue in terms of well, obviously, once you look at the policies of the junta and so on, you will find plenty wrong with it from the point of view of gender politics too. But these issues open up in Chile, and in some sense, the enclaves are an opportunity for it. But from another point of view, it also means society is active. So is it good? Is it bad? I mean, that can't.
Yeah, but in the Argentinian case, from 2001 onwards, there's a very big social activation. I mean, if you go to Buenos Aires, every day there's some sort of street demonstration of some kind. But precisely 2001, there was a mass, very important uprising.
See, I got that probably wrong because I don't know it. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. It's arguable. I mean, I think that there are all other indicators of lack of democratic quality which are present in both. But
that would be a separate topic, right? Social movements, political mobilization after the transition. Although when is the transition over in the Chilean case, it's hard to say. But that's in 2005. It's a date you could compare the two, and that would be a different topic. That was not your topic for today, and I kind of made statements about it. Could be wrong because Argentine society could be much more active and mobilized on certain issues. I wanted to ask you in conclusion about this topic of the impossible game. This is at one point O'Donnell made that term famous, and Lindsay and Stefan take it over. But first of all, what is the impossible game? The impossible game is that if you had 3 elections, the Peronists would win.
Mm-hmm.
But from the point of view of the, if you want to say bourgeoisie, but from the point of view of the economic power structure, it's unacceptable. So the referees called in to put an end to that. But they don't want the referee to rule. And so there is some kind of restoration. And the restoration could mean that the radical, some other party wins. But part of the impossible game is, the second stage of the impossible game, is that the Peronist unions will not allow it to govern.
New impossible
game. So even if someone else comes in through a democratic election, they won't be able to govern. Either the Peronists will, but then they are put an end to by the military, or somebody else wins, but they won't be able to govern because of the Peronists. So the military puts an end as the referee to that too. And then what? And now the impossible game is supposedly over with Menem, because he transforms the Peronist movement in such a way that they no longer represent this kind of threat. So they can win without threatening the economic power positions of the dominant classes. But the cost of it, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, and the the Linz and Stefan volume calls it from an impossible game to a possible game. What's the possible game? What's the possible game? Is the possible game democracy, in which either side can win, and you have a competitive system in which eventually social reforms can be undertaken? Or is the possible game another version of the cycle, right? In which the turn is from Peronist victory to delegative democracy to who knows what. The possible game part of the title kind of baffles me because I know that my first reading of it is okay, so Argentina is not democracy, and the possible game is democratic competition. But is that the possible game? Or is there some other thing that can? And I say this because the course will turn, not perhaps next week yet, but we will turn to the a point that O'Donnell himself introduced in his last writings, namely the erosion of democratic quality. And that erosion of democratic quality could be then the possible game, which is not a very attractive image, but at the same time, realistically, aren't we facing that? You know, even the United States, right? Adam's presentation. Is a low quality democracy the shift between higher quality democracy, low quality democracy? Is that the new cycle? I hope not for Argentina's sake, but in Brazil, you could say that's what you had, right? I mean, you had, I know lots of people who were involved in it in the Brazilian case. The optimism after the transition, first in the Cardoso government, and then with the Lula government, was very high. And so you have a period where all that optimism seems to have disappeared. And now that's over, but can it come back? And in the Argentine case, this becomes then exactly the issue that we were implicitly discussing, namely, what can happen now? And is the game now, and why would there be, this is still the Bonapartist idea, right, of Marx, is that a radical democracy is a threat to capitalism, right? And it can be, this is Marx's idea, right? That threat can be negated by Bonapartism, by an authoritarian turn. But is a low quality democracy still a threat, right? I mean, look at Menem, right? That administration. Delegated democracy, O'Donnell makes a mistake. In some point, he says, it's less liberal, but more democratic. I don't accept that. You have problem with it too, right? I don't know why he said that, because he was very opposed to it. But somehow, logically, he felt obliged to say, what is delegated democracy, right? Maybe we should have read the essay. I think now I put it on the list somewhere. A delegated democracy is you elect a government in the competitive, relatively free election, and then for 4 years that government does what it wants. It packs the courts and eliminates that threat. It controls Congress so that that threat also disappears. It interferes in the media, free media. People say, maybe Liza and Stefan decide this, that in the period of Menem, fear returned in Argentina. Why? Because people were somehow threatened, not threatened in a way that the military government threatened them, but by random acts of violence, which the government somehow in its rhetoric facilitated. So delegated democracy is a low quality democracy, but at the same time, the very same Menem transformed Peronism from a union-based quasi-social democratic form of populism, right? Which I think is not an incorrect description of classical Peronism, to a neoliberal version, which then, of course, means that though we do have a democracy that is based on populist identification of leadership with the people, at the same time, this version of democracy is not going to be a threat to capitalist enterprise. So a delegated democracy could represent yet another step in the cycle, which then an active society will challenge. Because after all, the idea that for 4 years they do whatever they wish to do, waiting for the next election. I mean, look at it in the Hungarian case now, in my case, right? I mean, Orban since 2010 could undertake any policies he wished, and from the point of view of an active civil society, or for that matter, even an active society in which there are political parties that wish to accomplish things and perhaps win elections, that's unacceptable. So the new cycle could be of a different type, coups, right? The old cycle was based on coups, not right. In some places, Mexico, coup was not the way. So in that sense, since maybe 1920, or you can give the more exact date,
1929,
59. 29, yeah. Since 1929, that type of intervention is out of bounds. Nevertheless, at different times, the PRI produces a very low quality democracy, if it can even be called a democracy. So perhaps, right?
yeah.
You wouldn't even call it a democracy. So a low quality democracy can reach that level. And then, of course, it has been challenged. So it's not as if Mexican society dies, but it lasts a long time. Lasts a long time till there is and then perhaps now we have another turn. So in this sense, the Argentine case, when referring to this type to this title again, could mean a possible game between low quality democracy and the attempts to restore a higher quality democracy. That would be a cycle too. It's not the old cycle. I mean, in your case, a coup is completely out of the realm of possibility. But now you could elect someone who will degrade democracy in significant ways, and perhaps that's the version, whatever that is. Maybe something. So perhaps that's the place where the course needs to go to examine cases. I introduced a new topic for next week, and I think
Next week.
next week. I'm getting a little confused because there is also the topic of an international effect. Did I put that after Alexandra's? It doesn't matter. If she minds, we can delay your presentation a week and have the international dimension, because that comparison is really interesting. The Chile Argentina comparison. I think throwing Brazil into that would be interesting as well. But somehow comparative